Boulton Paul Defiant Mk.I. July 19, 1949. Defiance of No 141 Squadron went up over the channel. 7 did not come back. That was the day the idea died. Not the airplane first, the idea. The Defiant was built around a powered turret and a two-man crew because British planners expected bomber interceptions, not fast, violent knife fights against single-seat fighters. It carried no forward-firing guns at all. None. The whole concept depended on the gunner winning the angle before the enemy did. Luftwaffe pilots learned fast. Come in head, on, or come in from below. The turret could not answer either attack properly, and the extra weight and drag of carrying that turret meant the Defiant was already slower and less agile than the fighters hunting it. It did not fail because it was badly built. It failed because it was designed for the wrong air war and introduced into the right one by mistake. Brewster F2A Buffalo. The Buffalo was not one airplane. That is the first thing you have to get right. In Finnish hands, the lighter B-239 fought effectively during the Continuation War and earned a reputation that still sounds unbelievable. In the Pacific, the heavier F2A3 was something else entirely. Extra weight, worse climb, worse turning, worse acceleration. At Midway, Marine Squadron VMF 221 threw Buffaloes into the path of Japanese strike aircraft and Zeros, 13 of 20 were lost. The survivors came back with exactly the opinion you would expect. The Buffalo was inadequate against the Zero in the fight it had been forced into. That does not make it universally bad. It makes it brutally context dependent. Finland fought different opponents, in different weather, in different variants, at different altitude. The Pacific was a different war. The Buffalo's failure was not a mystery. It was a mismatch so obvious that pilots paid for it in real time. Bell 39 Airacobra. The P-39 is one of the cleanest examples of a fighter being judged by the wrong battlefield mid-engine layout. Tricycle landing gear, a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. It looked advanced because it was advanced. The problem was what got taken out of it. Without an effective turbo supercharger, the Airacobra bled performance as altitude increased. That made it a poor fit for the air war the RAF expected over Western Europe and a limited fit for the US at high altitude in the Pacific. But down low, where speed in the dive punch and ruggedness mattered more than thin air performance, it could still do damage. That is why Soviet pilots used thousands of them effectively as low to mid-altitude fighters. Same aircraft, different air war. Different verdict. The PT-39 did not fail because it was junk. It failed in the places that demanded altitude it could not give and succeeded in the places that asked it to fight closer to the ground. Douglas TBD Devastator. By 1942, the US Navy already knew the TBD Devastator was finished. Too slow, too exposed, too dependent on a torpedo attack profile that demanded the one thing modern air combat no longer allowed: a long, straight, low altitude run at a defended fleet. At Midway, 41 Devastators launched from 3 American carriers. Only 6 came back. They scored no torpedo hit. That was not courage failing. That was physics, doctrine, and timing all lining up against a crew trapped in an obsolete machine. The Devastator had entered service in 1937 as a modern airplane. 5 years later, it was trying to survive in a sky that had already evolved past it. The replacement, the TBF Avenger, existed. It just was not there in numbers when the Navy needed it most. That is the real story. The TBD's failure was not discovered at Midway. Midway was simply the day the bill came due in public. Messerschmitt Me 210. The Me 210 was supposed to replace the BF 110 cleanly and completely. Instead, it became a warning label on what happens when production gets ahead of proof. First flown in 1939, the aircraft was intended to be the Luftwaffe's next heavy fighter, but pilots found it unstable, difficult, and unpredictable. The problem was not subtle. The airframe had handling vices serious enough that production had to be suspended in April 1942, while engineers tried to rescue the design. They did improve it, eventually. A redesigned fuselage and other changes removed some of the worst behavior, and that path led to the ME 410, which was at least serviceable, but the damage was already done. The ME 210 reached units before its own flight characteristics had been properly tamed. That is not a design maturing in service. That is a flawed machine being asked to mature around the people flying it. The Me 210 failed because schedule beat stability, and schedule should never win that fight. Heinkel He 280. The He 280 was first in the way history books love and procurement offices hate. First genuine jet fighter prototype. First proof that the idea could work. First glimpse of what the next generation of air combat was going to look like. And none of that mattered enough. Only 9 test aircraft were built. The program never reached operational status. It never saw combat. Why? Because being early is only useful if you are also decisively better. The engines were the problem. The Hess 8 power plants were not strong enough to secure the lead Heinkel had created, while the competing Me 262 benefited from the more powerful Jumo 004. By 1943, the choice was obvious to the German Air Ministry, and obvious choices are usually bad news for the design that got there first, but not far enough ahead. The He 280 did not fail because the jet fighter idea idea was wrong. It failed because it proved the concept without becoming the aircraft that could carry that concept into war. Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet. Nothing in World War II looked more untouchable on paper than the Me 163 rocket. Powered, violent climb, blinding speed. The first and only operational rocket interceptor ever fielded. It sounded like the future dropping into 1944 by accident. Then the rest of the numbers showed up. Roughly 8 minutes of powered flight, 1 or 2 attack passes at most. A glide home with no engine and no way to run if Allied escorts were waiting. And that was before the fuel started trying to kill the pilot. The Komet's propulsion system was so dangerous that leak, hard landings, and handling accidents could turn the aircraft into its own executioner. Even its combat success was limited. For all the terror its speed created, the practical results were tiny compared with the cost and risk. The Me 163 was not a useless machine. It was worse than that. It was a brilliant machine whose brilliance solved less than its danger created. Nakajima Mk.I 84 Hayate. On paper, the Mk.I 84 was exactly what late war Japan needed. Fast, heavily armed, capable of meeting American fighters on something close to equal terms. In test conditions, it looked like one of the best fighters Japan ever produced in numbers. But paper is not the war. The real Mk.I 84 reached frontline units in a country that could no longer reliably supply quality fuel, precision manufacturing, trained mechanics, or experienced pilots. The half-45 engine was demanding even under good conditions. Japan was no longer operating under good conditions. Manufacturing defects multiplied, landing gear failures became common. Maintenance standards slipped because the entire industrial system behind the aircraft was cracking, so the Mk.I 84 that should have been a war saver became something crueler. Proof that Japan's engineers still knew what to build after the country had lost the ability to build and sustain it properly. The aircraft itself was not the failure. The system that had to support it was, and by 1944, that system was collapsing in plain view. Kyushu J7W1 Shinden. The J7W1 Shinden looked like it came from a different decade. Canard foreplanes, pusher propeller, heavy nose armament, a shape that still looks futuristic even now, and that is exactly the trap people fall into with it. They judge it by the photographs instead of the record. Historically, the Shinden was an advanced interceptor concept that never progressed beyond the early prototype stage. It did not become a combat aircraft. It did not prove itself in squadron service. It did not get the time every radical design needs to expose its real strengths and real weaknesses. What it achieved instead was symbolic. It showed that Japanese designers were still thinking aggressively and imaginatively even in the final stage of the war. But imagination is not operational capability. The Shinden's legend is built on promise, not performance. That does not make it unimportant. It makes it unfinished. And unfinished aircraft do not change wars. They become museum pieces, what-ifs, and arguments. The J7W1 failed because the war ended before the airplane even had a chance to become fully real. Polikarpov I-185. The I-185 is the painful kind of failure, not the obvious one, not the embarrassing one. The kind where a country may have had the right answer, and still could not afford to make it real. Soviet trials rated the aircraft extremely highly. Limited frontline trials happened. Pilots liked what they saw. Performance with the right engine suggested a fighter that could stand with the best in the war. And that last phrase is exactly where the program died, with the right engine. The I-185 depended on power plants and production conditions that wartime Soviet industry could not reliably guarantee. Alternative engines diluted the performance advantage. Competing programs, especially those easier to mass produce with existing lines and materials, made more political and industrial sense. That is how good aircraft disappear. Not because they are beaten in the sky, but because another design is easier to build at scale right now. The I-185 never became a regular combat fighter. It became something historians always remember and wartime planners rarely can afford, the better answer arriving with the wrong production reality. Every aircraft on this list looked fixable from far enough away. A tactical adjustment, a better engine, a production change, more time. But war does not hand out extra time. It punishes delay, bad doctrine, weak industry, and the wrong machine in the wrong sky. These fighters failed for different reasons, but the ending was the same. Pilots climbing into aircraft already compromised before the fight even started. America's early jet projects wrote a different kind of failure story. Not slow, not obsolete, something stranger. Click the next video.